Hello, and welcome to this week's episode. We're going to be talking today about resilience, and I am joined by Professor Laura Chamberlain, who has been on the podcast before and is returning to talk about this topic. So, Pam is not here today, and that is not because Pam is binned off from the podcast. This is purely a diary class situation where Laura's topic is far too exciting for us to make you wait, and we couldn't manage to make all three diaries work together. Laura, huge welcome back because you've been before talking about curiosity. So, welcome back to the podcast. Say a little hello to our listeners and let them know who you are and why you're here.
Thank you so much, Jackie. I'm just thrilled to be here again, and I love your podcast. I listen religiously, so it's always an honour to be invited to come and speak to your lovely audience as well. If we've not met before, I'm Laura. I am a professor of marketing at the University of Warwick. I also run Think Talk Thrive, which is a professional development and career strategy agency. I also run Esteem, which is a business associated with helping marketers and marketing with their capabilities. And most recently, I have written a book about positive resilience called Brilliantly Bouncy, Discover Positive Resilience, which is why you have invited me back to talk on this topic today.
Yes, and I have read this book. So I was fortunate to read it even before it was published and absolutely loved it. So it was always a given that we were going to invite you to talk about this topic because resilience is so crucial, and it's something that comes up a lot for me with coaching clients, thinking about how they're feeling, what they're struggling with. And as a word, I feel like there's a lot of talk about resilience, but people maybe not necessarily really connecting with some of the conversation around it. And so for me, reading the book just felt like a whole new way to approach the topic, and hence why I was so keen to invite you back. So give us a bit of a flavour then in terms of where did your passion for resilience as a topic come from? And just, I guess, a bit of a flavour of what kind of you bring to it and how that thinking has been shaped?
That's a big question. If we think about the traditional way that resilience is talked about, and in our everyday lives, people talk about things like weathering storms or bouncing back from adversity or pushing through a rough patch. And a lot of the narrative around resilience is actually quite negative. And when I looked into the academic research, I can't help it, I'm an academic, so obviously that's where I go. A lot of the work on resilience has been done looking at people who are experiencing trauma. I have a very personal journey around resilience, which I actually do tell in the introduction, the preface to the book, because I had life throw me some quite significant curveballs at a really pivotal professional moment for me. And my boss once turned round to me and said that I'm the most resilient person that he knows. And because I deal with everything with humour, I think I turned around and I quipped and I said, yeah, like a little cockroach you can't get rid of. And I had subscribed to this really negative narrative around resilience and always associating it with the really big curveballs that life throws at us. And I went away and thought about it and thought about how I thought about my own resilience, but also how I could really reframe resilience and learn a lot more about resilience, not just in the context of these big curveballs being thrown at us, but in our everyday lives. And I was also seeing in my professional development work a lot of the frameworks, skills frameworks that companies and organizations put out there were really starting to talk about resilience as a skill and also as something that professionals were needing to develop. And alongside that, there's a professional narrative around people wanting and needing to become more resilient. And so I realized that a lot of people were only thinking about their resilience when life was throwing them a curveball. And I thought about the context that we actually make around roughly 35,000 decisions every day, and most of them are on autopilot. But all of those decisions that we're making are quietly shaping our resilience. And so if we only think about resilience when life's throwing us a curveball or when something really awful happens, we're not actually putting ourselves in the best space to think about and develop and grow our resilience. So I wanted to have a more everyday positive take on the topic of resilience.
Yeah, it's so interesting hearing you share that story because I remember a time in my career where I considered myself resilient at that point, and I think that impression came from I was constantly handling all of these things that were coming at me. And so to me, my definition and how I thought about resilience at that time probably sounds quite similar to your story around the cockroach of but for me it was almost I can take it, I can take whatever it throws, I'm going to still stand here. And there was almost this pride in being able to take all these blows and everything that was being thrown at me. And when I look back and how my thinking around resilience has shifted, and wow, I was probably in one of the least resilient places, least resourced places that I've been in my employed career at that point in time. And yet, in my head, I was proving that I was resilient. So I think it's a really interesting concept for us to play with and explore and see how, for our listeners, their thinking might start to shift on this. So, how would you, in terms of having gone away and done that reflection and started to bring together your thoughts for the book, which is amazing, by the way, highly recommend, have bought for other people. In terms of getting to that point, where is your thinking now? How would you define resilience in simple terms for our listeners?
So the way I like to think about our resilience is that it's actually like a dimmer switch. So it's not a light that we just turn on and off. So, something bad's happening. I now need to be more resilient. I'll turn the resilient light on. It's actually a dimmer switch, a lamp on a dimmer switch that's always there, glowing softly in the background, but it's ready to be turned up when you need it. And the thing with a lamp that's on a dimmer switch is that it needs to be fed by electricity. So actually what we need to do, in my view, to build our resilience is to find the source of electricity, the different ways in which we can put electricity into our lamp so that when we do need to be more resilient, we can just turn it up. And then when we don't need it so much anymore, we can turn it back down. I think I was definitely guilty of thinking of resilience like this switch that I flicked when crisis hit, or when you were talking about needing to be tough. And in the book, I talk about seeing it as this like badge of honor of surviving the really tough times. And actually, when I was thinking about it, I realized that you've got two options. You could either try and build your strength in the middle of a crisis when you're already depleted, or proactively build it during good times so it's available when you need it. And I think because resilience is something that we automatically think about when life throws us a curveball, and a lot of the narrative focuses on this idea of building your strength in the middle of a crisis, when actually that doesn't make any sense. It makes much more sense to see it almost as like a bank account and build your resilience reserves so that when you need them, they're there for you to call on.
Yeah, it's so interesting hearing you articulate it in that way because if I again reflect on my own experiences, there was very much this element, I think, of, like I said, pride for me. And I'm resilient enough to take this, I can handle it. And consequently, there would have been shame or feeling like I wasn't strong enough if I didn't cope with things. And I, again, see that pattern play out a lot with clients where there is this feeling that if you're not resilient enough, that's your fault. But by the point that you're thinking that, you're normally so depleted. And so I love that idea of that electricity supply so that you've got that there ready to dial up, as opposed to this feeling of you've just got to roll with the punches and take it and still expect that you can bounce back. So when people are thinking about applying this in a professional context. So, lots of our listeners will be in management or leadership roles. The pace of change is huge at the moment in many organizations. The economy can be a real challenge. And so, there's lots of changes to direction, projects, goals, focus, the adoption of AI, you name it. There's a lot that people are having thrown at them. How can people start to create some of that electricity supply when they may already be in some of that kind of, oh, feel like I'm running just to keep up?
Oh, and I recognize that feeling. I call it a bubble of overwhelm that I get in my chest when I know that I need to call on my resilience. And I feel it more regularly than I'd like at the moment. And I think that's also really important. It's completely normal to feel that. I'm not saying I can get rid of that. It's about finding ways to deal with it. And just to pick up on something you mentioned before, the reason why I called the book Brilliantly Bouncy is because I don't advocate for people bouncing back, because that actually doesn't acknowledge the fact that something has changed. So it's almost like bouncing back to where you were before, which isn't possible. And I find this idea of bouncing forward almost like a relentless momentum, which, given the context you've just described, I don't find that very helpful either. So the reason why I talk about people finding their bounce and bouncing brilliantly is actually because we're all unique and we all need to find our unique way of bouncing. The bounce metaphor being obviously for resilience. And in the book, I talk about people being more comfortably, confidently themselves, which is actually the goal in all of this. But in the professional context, I think there's a couple of myths that are really important to address. A lot of the professional skill frameworks that I referenced before will list resilience under like personal effectiveness or adaptability, as if we can somehow separate our professional resilience from our personal resilience. And we're not work robots, right? We're bringing our whole human selves to work every day. And so I think it really does allow us to center and reflect on that human element around who we are at work and what we bring to work, and also to take the temperature check of where you're at in terms of your energy levels, the decisions that you're making, things like that. And I think one of the important things that I talk about in the book is the fact that we have a lot of opportunities to make choices. And in a professional context, this can be quite profound. I already mentioned the statistics around how many choices we make every day, but we also make choices on autopilot at work. So saying yes to last minute meeting requests when we're stretched thin, or skipping lunch because your to-do list can feel really overwhelming. And those aren't just micro moments in your day, they're opportunities to build or conversely drain your resilience. And so I think building in awareness of the choices that we're making and questioning some of the things that perhaps we do on autopilot. Skipping lunch is a big one for me that I know doesn't do me any good, for example. It sounds like something really minor, but actually all of these little things add up to help build our resilience. But in the book, there are lots of practical tools that I have developed. Some are quite small, some are more robust, and there's reflection questions and worksheets that can be accessed through the book. But I talk a lot about the idea of choices and how we can protect our energy. And so having what I call choice anchors, so like pre-decided responses or boundaries or rules that you put in place. But there are other things that people can do in terms of thinking about what energizes them and what drains them in a work context, and that can be people, it can be activities, because actually if we can do more of the things that energize us and less of the things that drain us, then that's a really positive way to build resilience. And also little things like developing what I call control codes, power phrases that can really help people to protect their energy, but also to give them guiding north stars to help them through the decision making points. They're some of the practical things. But I think the big one for me is leaning into our strengths. And I know this is a topic, Jackie, that you really talking about. But I, in the book, talk about the fact that in an ideal world, we need to not just think about what our strengths are, but lean into them and stretch them. And I developed a tool called the Strength Star, which looks at strengths in a slightly different way to help people to think about their strengths away from that list that we all parrot that's contained on our CV, or the things that we say I'm really good at, and really get to grips with what that means for us as individuals.
Yeah, I really want to pick up actually on the choices piece that you mentioned. And listening as you were describing it, I was thinking about I'm pretty full in terms of my coaching roster at the moment. And one of the things that's been really interesting for me is looking at how and when do I schedule coaching sessions, because if I schedule too many coaching sessions in a day, then I'm not at my best. The coachee doesn't get the best from me, but also it doesn't give me the capacity to get the other things done that I need to get done around it. And if I reflect on how that choice now is different for me than it perhaps would have been historically, I think I was very similar to a lot of people where I was generally at other people's behest. If a meeting request went in and that time was showing as free in my calendar, I felt obliged to accept it, regardless of mentally I may have wanted that time for something else. And even today, I had a coaching session with a client where a lot of what we were discussing was considering how can you set your week up to best support your energy, your capacity for thinking, the things that you need to get done within a week. And there were so many more choice points when we explored in detail than that person had originally realized, because it feels like a lot of your diary is probably done to you when
Mm.
you're in a senior role, and you feel like you've got to do all these tasks and you've got to attend all these things, but often you've got more choice than you realize. But because you make those choices subconsciously and habitually based on just what you've done before, I think when people start to consider those elements and what they can make conscious choices of, there is a lot of opportunity to make choices differently that perhaps they hadn't realized first.
I think there's 2 points there. One is like what's in your control and what's not in your control is really important. But in the process of actually writing the book, I made a lot of people around me laugh quite a lot, because I am not a morning person, but I got up at 4 o'clock in the morning to write the book for a couple of hours before my family woke up. And I did that for 7 days a week. And this is not something that I advocate for everybody, but it was the result of me doing a lot of work around my own productivity and understanding myself. And I actually talk now about the fact that I don't subscribe to time management. I subscribe to the idea of energy management and knowing when I'm at my best to do the kind of work that is for different kinds of work. So for me, if I want to do deep thinking, creative work, I need to find uninterrupted time in the morning. I am not, if I absolutely have to, then of course I can, but I am best doing that kind of work in the morning, particularly early morning. And if I look back and think about 25-year-old me would be recoiling in horror right now at the thought of me saying I'm a morning person who get up this early. And it's not for everybody. Okay. And the other thing I would also say around that is, because people are probably pulling faces and recoiling in horror themselves, I don't get up really early in the morning to do admin. I don't get up in the morning to write my emails. The thing that meant I got out of bed consistently to do that work was working on a project that I really wanted to do and I really believed in. So it was almost like my special time to get the thing that was so important to me done. And of course, writing a book is a bit of a passion project. So it's not exactly the best example. But with the energy management piece, it's so useful to think about your ebbs and flows and what works for you when in the day. Of course, I can't always control in my full-time role when people require meetings of me. But if somebody says to me, can we have a meeting? I will shoot back and say, yes, and offer them times after 2 o'clock, because generally that's my best time for meetings. I also try and build in buffers. So I generally try to have a 45-minute meeting, but I block the hour to give myself a 15-minute buffer at the end of the meeting to get things off my desk straight away that are outcomes or outputs of that meeting that are easy for me to deal with. Or if they're bigger tasks, I then put them onto my to-do list and figure out when I'm going to do them in my day. But I have two young children, and so I finish work at 5 o'clock. I go to pick up my children, and then I am done for the day. I don't now try and work in the evenings unless there is something so super important happening, because my best time is first thing in the morning. I was also finding just random information that people might find useful. I was finding that if I was working in the evening and I was at a screen, I wasn't sleeping as well. So by having that finish of my day earlier than it initially was comfortable for me, I have found that over time I do go to bed earlier, but by not being in front of a screen in an evening and working in an evening has really helped me in terms of the quality of my sleep, and then enabling me to have this pattern of working. I'm not saying that everybody has to work in the same way, but it took a lot of reflection and consideration in terms of thinking about what works for me right now. And I use that term right now really purposefully because my children are 4 and 1. They don't sleep the best. As my family commitments, my work commitments, and various things change, that pattern will change as well. But I'm self-aware and open to it changing and figuring out what will work best for me at any particular point in time. And that's been a real game changer for me.
I love those points. And we've got a whole episode actually on managing energy rather than time. So we'll link to that in the show notes because, as a fundamental principle, I think it's so key and so different again to what people have often assumed that they needed to do. And you've got a finite capacity in terms of time, but your energy management can allow you to deliver far more or far less from the same amount of time depending upon how you go about it. So, yeah, completely echo what you're saying. There's so many other points that threads that I could follow from what you talked about. But one question that I have around resilience is within organizations, people are leading and managing teams. There are, beyond that, functions, divisions, whole organizations. How can resilience start to play out differently beyond just the individual? So if somebody is leading or managing a team and they've got one or more members of that team where they know that there is going to be some pressure, there's going to be some pinch points, or maybe there already is, how can you start to translate this for teams rather than just individuals?
So, again, speaking back to the traditional negative narrative around resilience, there was something that I found during my research on resilience that blew my mind. And this is that resilience doesn't have to be lonely. So when I had traditionally thought about resilience, it was a solo endeavor. It was something that was down to me. And you were talking then about how you felt about it when you felt you were taking all these blows, as it were, and I can be strong and I can withstand all this stuff that's happening to me. And we automatically think that's something we have to weather alone. But actually, it doesn't have to be lonely. And there's research that's been done to show that we can actually build other people's resilience by being kind to them. And so when we give compliments or we're kind to other people, it actually builds our resilience and theirs at the same time, which is just brilliant. But also, most importantly, resilience is actually a team sport, and it's not something we have to build alone. And there's lots of elements around this that I cover in the book, but I think the one that really sticks with me is the phrase that someone that I know's granny once said to me, which is friends should be like radiators and not drains. And that applies very much in personal lives, but it applies so powerfully to teams. And it's this idea of how we can find ways to be reciprocal and give other people energy. And this isn't about people's necessarily their sort of natural state, whether they're an energetic person or a more, I call them more Eeyore kind of people. It's not about that at all, but it's about how we can actually create radiator culture in teams, how we can think about the interplay of different personality types or people within teams, and think about how we can actually create like a structure around the team that actually allows people a bit of a playing field to support one another and to therefore build teams resilience.
That's so interesting to hear. And again, reflecting on my experiences, I guess when I look back, I feel actually really fortunate that I think in a lot of professional contexts, I was part of that kind of team support network. And the situation that I was describing earlier, I was more individualistic in that role. So I was involved in quite a lot of cross-functional projects and had some really solid internal relationships, but I didn't have the same sense of team and that radiator energy that you're describing that I've perhaps had in other roles and at other times, where I was then better resourced through that support. And I think there's also something, isn't there, in that sense of, one of the things that I find quite difficult and have found quite difficult in my career is asking for help. And I think there's a sense often with people who pride themselves in their strength and their ability to cope with things, that it often doesn't occur to them to ask for help. And other people may not perceive that they need it. But when you have more of that tighter network and more of that collaborative sense of the interconnectedness, that you don't necessarily need to ask for it. People pull together and it happens. There is a support network that is there where it happens naturally. And so if I reflect on my experiences, I'm, oh, that makes sense of the teams where I felt very supported versus where it was more individualistic.
Yeah, and there are lots of different ways that can play out, but equally, this isn't about not understanding and working with individual differences. So I've worked with clients before where we've created like user manuals for a team to help people to understand the interplay and the best way for people to work with each other and to play into each other's strengths, and also things to be aware of, particularly around boundaries, for example. So saying when people do check emails or when they don't. And so people can actually be really supportive in terms of that energy managing piece that we were just discussing. So there are different ways in which you can have that radiator energy, and it's not just about people bouncing around being super happy all the time and trying to g each other up, as it were. There are lots of really practical small ways that people can support each other and have that radiator culture. And it can also be learning time. So sharing articles, it can be finding ways to have conversation points within the team around topics that really matter. There's lots of things there. I call those opportunity pockets, finding those micro moments to engage with different things or different learning. And I think there's a lot there that can be explored in terms of helping teams to develop this culture of resilience.
Again, I'm reflecting on work that I do with clients. So that user guide type approach that you describe is also something that I've used with teams, both teams that I've been a part of and led, and also when I've worked with clients. And it's fascinating when you ask a group of people the same questions and share those different responses, the degree of insight that you can get that you might not otherwise get. And I think this sense of connection that can be built from sharing things in the right way is huge. And I think that's something that often gets missed. It feels sometimes that the time for people to be able to connect is deprioritized. And yet, when you invest in it and when you invest in the relationships first, everything else becomes easier because you have those boundaries, you have that understanding, you have that ability to support and to know each other's strengths and to know how you can come together to create something bigger. And I think the investment in that for team resilience and for team capacity is huge and is often underrated.
100% agree. And I think you made a point there around strengths, and it made me think back to the strength star that's in the book. And I talk about the things that give them energy as a strength. I talk about their sweet spot. So thinking about when people are in flow, what are they doing at that point in time? And I think using tools like that to really understand a team's strengths and thinking about how you can actually help people to lean into those strengths, but also stretch those strengths becomes really important. But also sharing strengths as well, like the strengths in other people. So one of the points of the strength star is actually perceived strength and really understanding what other people see as your strengths. And I think in teams, if you share what you perceive to be other team members' strengths, it really does open out conversations in terms of how people can lean into those, do more of those things, and also to help people feel really valued, like they're making a contribution that other people are seeing and appreciating and understanding the impact of. And I think that can also be really powerful. So it's not sitting around and giving each other meaningful compliments, or meaningless compliments, I was going to say, but that's not what I mean. It's not surface level. There's lots of things that people can do to really think about this idea of building a resilient culture and appreciating the individual differences within the team, within that resilience.
So, what would you say as we come towards the end for people who are maybe feeling like their resilience isn't where they'd like it to be? What would you say would be the key takeaways, the kind of start points for people that want to start to feed that electricity supply, be able to apply the dimmer switch when needed?
I think an energy audit is the best place to start. And by that, what are the things that give you energy? They can be people, it can be activities. And what are the things or people that drain you? And just being really honest with yourself around what those are and observing it. So it's not about making a change to start off with, but it's just merely identifying what are the things that give you energy and what are the things that drain you. And then you can look at, maybe it's through your diary or whatever works for you, how much of your time are you spending on or with people or doing things that give you energy, and conversely, how much of your time are you spending doing things or with people that drain you. Understanding that builds a platform for making some decisions, and those may be decisions that are within your control, but also having an eye on things that may not be within your control. And if something's not within your control, that's okay. It's not a case of throwing your hands up in the air going, oh, I can't do anything about it, that's not in my control. It's about understanding then where you do have control and where therefore you have the opportunity to either put in boundaries or to facilitate change or to have conversations with other people that may be helpful. But the first point is not to rush to action. It is actually taking stock, and almost this idea of an audit is the first point of call. But I find that idea of energy as one that's really powerful, just to think, oh, well, no wonder I'm not feeling particularly great at the moment. I'm spending a lot of time doing things that potentially drain me. Or it may be I'm not feeling particularly resilient at the moment, but I'm also not spending time doing things that particularly drain me. So where is this disconnect coming from? And it just allows that thought process around identifying your resilience landscape at this point in time.
And then what next then? So people have done that audit and have taken stock. Where would they go next?
So then I think it's around identifying whether you want to work on your own, building your own resilience, or if you're thinking more in terms of a leadership role or in terms of a team. But you can do things like develop your choice anchors. So think about the choices that you're making and putting some parameters and boundaries around choices that you make. Finding your opportunity pockets. So these are those small micro moments where you can engage with resilience building activities. But then more on a sort of deeper level, I would advocate for really using tools like the Strength Star to understand where a different way of thinking about your strengths, where your strengths lie, and thinking about how you can lean into those. And actually in the book, the last chapter in the book, I talk about creating a bit of a resilience action plan based on all the concepts in the book, just to give people a framework to help them to find a path forward.
So, where can people get hold of the book? Where do they come to find it?
The book is available on Amazon. So there's a paperback version and a Kindle version. And I should also say it is designed for busy people. So it's a relatively short book. It's about 150 pages long. I think you said, Jackie, you read it in about 2 hours. And that was a conscious decision on my part. I didn't want to write a weighty tome on this topic. There's lots more resources and lots more ways to work with me or get in contact with me. I have a newsletter and various things. You can go to brilliantlybouncy.com to find that, and there'll be lots more coming from me in the next few months. But I wanted the book to be accessible, and I think that when people hear a professor's written a book, they assume it's going to be incredibly academic and written a certain way. And just to mention that it's not at all. It's very much me, written in my style and with my sense of humor, which some people may or may not find funny. But it's a very practical, human approach to the topic. It's not academic at all.
And I can absolutely vouch for that. And our listeners will know we are very much about the practical on this podcast, very much about what can you take away. And that for me was what I really loved about the book. It was so accessible in terms of time. It didn't feel like a huge commitment, but also there are just so many simple practical exercises that are not going to take you hours and hours to do, but will really make a difference. And I know you've had incredible feedback from people that have been putting those into place. So, yeah, absolutely recommend the book. Go find it on Amazon and do connect with Laura on LinkedIn and go to brilliantlybouncy.com as well. Laura, thank you so much for joining me. It's been amazing to get to talk through all of this. And I feel like the conversation has gone in many and varied directions. But yeah, I really hope that for our listeners, you're able to take some of those practical elements and hopefully start to reframe how you might want to consider resilience and how you might want to build it for yourself and for your team. As ever, thank you so much for listening, and we'll be back next week with another episode.